There is a lie that settles quietly in many minds as the years pass. It says that life's meaning expires at a certain age, that value ends when productivity slows, that once the big responsibilities are fulfilled, what remains is only waiting. This lie is not shouted. It is whispered through indifference, through unanswered calls, through conversations that no longer ask for your opinion. And over time, that whisper becomes a voice that says, "You are done." But aging does not empty life of meaning. What truly empties it is when others stop listening. Growing older does not erase the need to be heard. On the contrary, it deepens it. Because when time has passed through a person, it leaves behind stories, lessons, mistakes survived, loves lost and rebuilt. All of that does not disappear just because the body slows down. Yet many older people begin to speak less, not because they have nothing to say, but because they feel that no one is interested anymore. And silence, when it is imposed, slowly convinces the heart that its voice no longer matters. There is something deeply painful about realizing that your words are no longer requested. Advice that once was sought becomes ignored. Experiences that could illuminate another's path are brushed aside as outdated. And so many choose to withdraw, not out of pride but out of exhaustion. It hurts less to be quiet than to feel invisible. This is how people disappear emotionally long before they ever disappear physically. But meaning is not a function of age. Meaning is born from connection, from being recognized as someone who still feels, still thinks, still carries an inner world worthy of attention. Old age does not cancel desire, curiosity, or emotional depth. What often cancels them is the message, repeated subtly, that it is too late, that it is no longer necessary, that the time for significance has passed. And when a person begins to believe that message, something vital begins to fade. Yet even in this stage of life, meaning can still be created. Not in the same way as before, perhaps not through achievement or accumulation, but through presence, through sharing a memory that helps someone understand themselves, through expressing a feeling that gives permission to another to feel their own, through being seen not as a burden, but as a person with a history that still speaks. Many older adults believe that to age well is to ask for nothing, to stay quiet, to not disturb. But asking to be heard is not demanding, it is human. Wanting to matter is not selfish, it is essential. And there is dignity in continuing to speak even when the world seems distracted. Because silence does not protect, it erases. A society that stops listening to its elders loses more than memories. It loses depth. It loses perspective. It loses the chance to learn that life does not end when speed does, that value is not measured only by efficiency. That wisdom grows precisely where time has left its marks. When older people are given space to speak, something heals on both sides. The one who speaks remembers they still exist. The one who listens learns they are not alone in their fears. And perhaps the most painful truth is this: many older people are not asking for solutions. They are not asking to be fixed. They are asking to be included, to be asked how they are and to be allowed to answer honestly, to feel that their presence still changes something, even if it is just a conversation, just a moment, just a shared silence. Old age still deserves meaning because the human soul does not retire. It continues to feel, to remember, to hope, even quietly. And when we make room for those voices, when we stop rushing past them, we restore something essential. The idea that life is valuable until the very end. Because as long as someone is willing to listen, no one is finished. A moment in life when you realize something has changed. Not because someone told you, but because no one did. No one asked how you were. Not out of cruelty, not out of malice, just absence. And that absence begins to hurt more than any harsh word ever could. Because when no one asks how you are, what you hear inside is not silence. It's a question, do I still matter? Old age doesn't arrive with pain by itself. It arrives with time, with memories, with a body that has lived. What hurts is something else. What hurts is noticing that the world keeps moving, but it no longer looks back at you. That conversations happen around you, not with you. That your presence becomes habitual, predictable, almost invisible. And little by little, you begin to doubt yourself. You start answering, "I'm fine," before anyone even asks. You stop sharing what weighs on you because you don't want to bother. You learn to shrink emotionally, to take up less space, to disappear politely. And that is where the real pain begins, not in aging, but in being emotionally abandoned while still being alive. Because being old is not the same as being finished, but being ignored can make it feel that way. Loneliness in old age rarely arrives like a decision. It doesn't knock on the door and announce itself. It enters quietly, disguised as routine, as days that look the same, as weeks when nothing particularly bad happens, yet something essential is missing. People often believe that those who are alone chose it, that they pushed others away, that they preferred distance. But most of the time, loneliness was not chosen. It was inherited from circumstances, from changes, from losses that accumulated slowly. It begins when life reorganizes itself without asking for permission. Retirement removes daily contact. Friends move away or fall ill. Some leave forever. Children grow, form their own lives, and visits become occasional instead of habitual. None of this feels dramatic at first. It feels logical, natural. And yet, with each small change, something thins. The conversations shorten. The phone rings less. The silence stretches. At first, many older people make excuses for others. They understand. Everyone is busy. Life is demanding. They tell themselves they don't want to be intrusive. They learn to wait. And waiting becomes a habit. Days pass without meaningful interaction, but still, they don't complain. Because complaining feels like weakness. And because they fear that if they speak, they might confirm their worst fear, that no one really has time anymore. So loneliness settles in quietly, without conflict. It sits beside them during meals eaten alone. It listens when the television fills the room just to break the silence. It accompanies them to bed, where thoughts become louder than during the day. And slowly, something dangerous happens. Loneliness stops being an external situation and begins to feel like an internal flaw. Many start asking themselves what they did wrong, why people drifted away, why they were not interesting enough, important enough, necessary enough to be remembered. And this self-blame hurts deeply because it turns a social wound into a personal one. Loneliness becomes shameful, something to hide, something that confirms the idea that maybe they deserve to be alone. But loneliness in old age is not a moral failure. It is not a character defect. It is often the result of a society that values speed over presence, productivity over connection, a society that admires beginnings but grows uncomfortable with continuity, and those who can no longer keep up are left behind, not intentionally but effectively. The cruel part is that many older adults are surrounded by people and still feel alone, because loneliness is not about quantity but about quality. You can be in a room full of family and still feel invisible if no one looks you in the eyes and asks how you truly are. You can receive help and still feel alone if no one listens to what you feel beyond your needs. And over time, to survive this loneliness, many adapt. They lower their expectations. They tell themselves they no longer need much. They learn to live with less emotional contact, convincing themselves that this is what maturity looks like. But resignation is not peace. It is a form of emotional surrender. What hurts most is that loneliness changes the way people relate to themselves. They stop sharing their inner world. They stop naming their sadness. They become experts at endurance, but beginners at joy. And the longer this lasts, the harder it becomes to ask for connection, because asking feels like admitting failure. Yet loneliness was never proof that they failed. It is proof that they are human, that they still need others, that they still feel. And feeling is not a weakness at any age. It is evidence of life. When loneliness is understood this way, something shifts. The shame softens. The silence becomes less heavy, and space opens for compassion toward oneself first, because before anyone else reaches out, there must be permission to acknowledge the pain without judgment. Loneliness did not arrive because you chose it. It arrived because life changed. And recognizing that truth is the first step toward remembering that you still deserve connection, not as a reward but as a right, because being alone was never the problem. Being forgotten was. There comes a moment in many lives when asking for help begins to feel heavier than carrying the pain alone. Not because the pain is small, but because the fear of being a burden grows larger. In old age, this fear becomes almost invisible, woven into everyday gestures. It is the hesitation before making a call, the sentence that remains unfinished, the smile that hides fatigue. It is the decision to stay quiet, not out of strength, but out of consideration for others. Many older people learn slowly and painfully that the world seems to value them less when they need more. They sense impatience in hurried voices, discomfort in shortened visits, distraction in conversations that drift away before reaching anything real. And from these small signals, a belief is born: I shouldn't bother anyone. This belief doesn't come from selfishness, it comes from love, from the desire not to add weight to lives that already seem full. So they begin to protect others from themselves. They downplay their sadness, they hide their fears, they say they are fine even when they are not, because admitting otherwise feels like asking for too much. They convince themselves that endurance is dignity, that silence is maturity, that needing less is a virtue. And slowly, they disappear emotionally, even while still being present physically. This fear of being a burden is one of the most silent forms of suffering in old age. It doesn't cry out, it doesn't demand attention, it simply closes doors from the inside. It teaches people to shrink their needs until they barely recognize them. And when a person stops expressing what hurts, others may assume there is nothing there. Silence gets mistaken for peace, but carrying everything alone has a cost. When pain is not shared, it turns inward. It becomes heavier, more confusing. Sadness loses its words and transforms into exhaustion. Loneliness deepens because connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability feels forbidden. The person who fears being a burden often becomes the one who suffers the most quietly. What makes this especially tragic is that the fear is often misplaced. Most of the time, loved ones are not rejecting the person, they are simply unaware. They don't see the inner struggle because it has been carefully hidden. And so a gap grows, not from lack of love, but from lack of communication. Both sides miss each other while standing close. There is a cruel paradox here. The desire not to be a burden ends up depriving others of the chance to care. It takes away the possibility of shared humanity. Because relationships are not built only on giving, they are built on allowing oneself to receive. To be needed is not always a weight. Sometimes it is a bridge. Asking for attention does not make someone weak. It makes them honest. Expressing pain does not steal energy from others. It often creates meaning. When someone is allowed to be present with another's vulnerability, something real happens. Connection deepens, roles soften, love finds a place to rest. Old age should not require emotional self-erasure. No one earns the right to be heard only when they are strong, independent, or useful. Worth is not measured by how little one needs. And dignity is not found in silence, but in truth. The idea that love must be effortless to be valid is one of the greatest misunderstandings of human relationships. Many older adults believe that speaking up will push people away, but often the opposite is true. What pushes people away is distance, not honesty. When emotions are named, they invite understanding. When needs are expressed, they give direction. When someone says, I am not okay, they are not asking to be rescued, they are asking to be accompanied. Letting others see your vulnerability is not a failure of independence, it is an act of courage. It says, I trust you enough to show you who I am. And trust is not a burden, it is a gift. No one should have to disappear emotionally to make others comfortable. Aging does not mean becoming invisible. It does not mean turning pain into silence. It does not mean carrying everything alone to prove worth, because the moment someone feels like a burden is often the moment they need connection the most. There is a question so small that it often goes unnoticed, yet so powerful that it can soften even the hardest day. How are you? Not the polite version that expects a quick find, but the real one, the kind that pauses, that waits, that is willing to hear the answer. In old age, this question becomes rare, and when it disappears, something essential disappears with it. Because being asked how you are is not about information, it is about recognition. When someone truly asks how you are, they are saying, I see you. They are acknowledging that there is an inner world behind the aging body, behind the familiar face, behind the routine. And that acknowledgement has a healing effect. It reminds a person that they are not just existing, but still relating, still affecting others. It returns dignity in a way that medicine and comfort cannot. Many older people no longer expect this question. They've learned to live without it. Conversations become practical. Appointments, medication, schedules, needs, everything revolves around function. And while care is important, being cared for is not the same as being emotionally met. A person can be assisted and still feel profoundly alone if no one asks how they are feeling inside. What makes this especially painful is that when the question finally comes, many don't know how to answer it anymore. They hesitate, they minimize. They say they're fine because they don't want to open something that might be inconvenient. Years of not being asked teaches people to stay closed. And yet, even then, something inside relaxes when the question is asked sincerely. Because it offers permission to speak, to feel, to exist without having to justify it. Listening, in this stage of life, is more valuable than advice. Older people are not waiting for solutions to every problem. They're waiting to be accompanied in their experience. They're waiting for someone to sit with them without rushing, without correcting, without turning the conversation back to themselves. They are waiting for presence. And presence heals because it tells the nervous system, you are not alone right now. A genuine how are you does something remarkable. It reopens the door to meaning. It invites memory, emotion, reflection. It allows someone to share not only what hurts, but what still matters to them. And in doing so, it reconnects them to their own inner life, which may have been neglected or silenced for too long. We often underestimate how much weight a few attentive minutes can carry. In a world obsessed with speed, slowing down to listen is an act of care. It communicates respect. It tells someone that their pace, their words, their feelings are worth time. And for someone who feels forgotten, time given freely is one of the deepest forms of love. There is also something transformative for the one who listens. When we truly hear an older person, we gain access to depth, to perspectives shaped by loss, resilience, endurance. We are reminded that life is not only about becoming but also about having been. And this exchange enriches both sides even if it lasts only a moment. Asking how someone is does not require fixing their pain. It requires staying. It requires tolerating discomfort, allowing silence, and resisting the urge to move on too quickly. It requires humility, the understanding that sometimes the most helpful thing we can do is witness rather than change. For those who are older, being asked how you are confirms that you still belong to the human conversation, that your feelings are not outdated, that your inner life did not expire with your youth, and that confirmation can restore something that loneliness erodes, the sense of being part of a shared world. A single sincere question cannot change a life, but it can change a moment. And sometimes, a moment is enough to remind someone that they are still here, still seen, still important. Because when someone asks how you are and truly listens, you don't just answer a question, you remember that you exist. There is a moment when people begin to believe that their time has already spoken, that whatever they had to give was given, and that what remains is simply repetition. This belief does not come from age itself, but from the way the world responds to it. When no one asks for your thoughts, your stories, your perspective, it becomes easy to assume that your voice no longer adds anything. And slowly, meaning starts to feel like something that belongs to the past. But meaning does not expire with youth. It changes shape. In earlier years, meaning often comes from building, achieving, proving. Later in life, it comes from understanding, remembering, transmitting, from making sense of what was lived, from placing words on experiences that once felt confusing or painful. This kind of meaning is quieter, but it is no less essential. Many older people carry entire histories inside them that were never fully spoken, loves that shaped them, losses that transformed them, choices they still question, lessons they learned the hard way. All of that remains alive inside, waiting for a space where it can be shared. When there is no such space, these experiences turn inward. They become weight instead of wisdom. Being allowed to speak, to be heard without interruption or dismissal, restores something fundamental, the feeling of continuity. It reminds a person that their life is not a closed chapter, but a story that still resonates, that what they live can still illuminate something for someone else. And even if it doesn't, even if it is only shared for the sake of being shared, it still matters. Because expression itself is a form of dignity. Old age often brings a strange contradiction. People are physically present yet emotionally sidelined. They are included in gatherings but excluded from depth. They are cared for but not consulted. And over time this creates a quiet grief, not for what was lost, but for what is no longer invited. The grief of no longer being asked, no longer being considered part of the dialogue. But the voice does not lose its value because it has spoken many times before. In fact, repetition is part of how humans make sense of life. Telling the same story again is not a sign of decline, it is often an attempt to integrate meaning, to find peace, to be understood. When we stop listening, we interrupt that process. When we listen, we participate in it, meaning in old. Age is not about starting over, it is about being allowed to complete something, to say what was never said, to be seen in one's complexity, not reduced to age, dependency or routine, to feel that one's inner world still has a place in the world outside. And this meaning does not only belong to the one who speaks, it also belongs to those who listen, because listening to someone who has lived longer expands our sense of time. It reminds us that today will one day become memory, that what feels urgent now may feel different later, that life is not only about what comes next, but also about what stays with us. When older people are given a voice, something shifts. They straighten emotionally, their presence becomes fuller, they reconnect with themselves. And in that reconnection, loneliness loosens its grip, not because everything is resolved, but because existence is confirmed. Old age still deserves meaning because the need to be recognized does not fade, the desire to belong does not disappear, the human soul does not reach an age where it stops asking to be seen. And as long as someone is willing to listen, life is still speaking.